Well, hello YouTube. Welcome to the channel, everybody. How y'all doing on this beautiful day out here documenting the cemetery today? And I have a story for you guys as well. Been looking for this cemetery for a while here. I'm gonna sit down here if you don't mind. I got a little story for you guys today about these graves right here. Now, like I said, we've been working on this particular story for over a year. One reason we simply couldn't find it. We attempted this story last year and ended up, scratching the whole thing. The locations of these mountain cemeteries are very difficult usually, even if you do have an address or GPS, which is pretty rare, and it's usually wrong, but more often than not it's simply blank. Also, there can be multiple cemeteries with the same name, or people call them by different names, and this cemetery was no exception. We found it finally because we have a relative buried here named Perry Daniels right up the hill here, and we got some help locating him, which obviously located the cemetery. This video is dedicated to him, by the way. This actually involves his direct family. The Hatfield and McCoy feud is always the most talked about in feud lore in the area, but there was actually another feud, and they even mirrored the Hatfield-McCoy feud because one family was on the West Virginia side and the other was on the Kentucky side of the border. This feud was infamous and well known in its time. The only difference is it never got Kevin Costner to stir up, attention about it again and make it a well-known thing. This was the Christian Daniels feud. Now, I'm going to give you a brief overview of the feud and some of the players, but I have a particular story to tell today, and to put right an outright lie that has never been proven before today. The path to the Christian Daniels feud is very complicated and long, but it was after a series of wrong deeds on both ends that led to many violent events. After some more bloodshed, this time the killing of a Christian by a Daniels, the two families and their friends became involved in a full-on feud. And for a while, both factions were running around heavily armed and looking for trouble. While Jim Daniels took up refuge in his parents' home, his friends were busy going around to various neighbors, borrowing Winchester rifles, with the story that the guns were needed to kill off a flock of wild turkeys. Although wild turkeys were all over the area at the time, no one seemed to believe the story. At the time, Pike County, Kentucky was enormous in size, and police officers were very few and far between. Because the Daniels lived in such a remote mountainous area on the banks of a river, away from the convenience of cleared roads other than, the railroad track basically. Ouch, thorn in my hand. Jim knew the chance of police officers venturing out into the hills to capture him was slim, but he also knew it was a matter of time before his cousins came back to take the law into their own hands. Meanwhile, Bud and Mose Christian rode down to Pike County Courthouse with a group of more than 60 of their comrades and filed for a warrant for the arrest of Jim Daniels on the charge of murdering Hiram Christian. Because there were no officers in the immediate area near the Daniels home, the group of men were temporarily deputized and given authority to go capture Jim Daniels, dead or alive. Given the time of year, the men decided to use the upcoming holiday to their advantage. So they waited until Thanksgiving Day in 1909. The Christians set forth to find their man and serve the warrant. The brothers built a posse of more than 60 men, family and friends, who were hell-bent on getting a piece of Jim Daniels themselves. Because the Daniels home was situated on a creek at the Kentucky-West Virginia border, the posse thought it would be best to split up and hit them from both sides, as to give Jim nowhere to run. One group, headed up by Mose Christian and Bob Simpkins, came upon the house from the West Virginia side, and the other group, headed by John Farrell and Bud Christian, sneaked up on the house from the Kentucky side. The West Virginia posse went by way of railroad tracks. Many of both the Daniels and Christian family members worked on those railroad tracks and for the Norfolk and Western Railroad, and they suspected that their familiarity with the tracks might make it a common route for them to travel. Those on the Kentucky side took a more straightforward approach and rode right up to his house, surrounding it from all four sides. None of the men were officers, but they claimed that they were deputized as special constables to get Daniels. But right here is where the stories diverge. You see, there are two totally different versions of what happened on that fateful day. The Christian version of the story paints a picture of a teenage Annie Oakley type girl straddling over her mother's dead body as it lays at her feet in the doorway, calmly blasting away bullets at the posse with a gun in each hand like Rambo. They painted this young girl as both fearless and dangerous, as well as a sharpshooter who not only shot one of the men in the posse, but also shot a hat clean off another man's head. It is said that the Christian boys rode up to the house, calling out to Jim and Charles that they had a warrant for their arrest on the count of murder, in good faith and keeping with the law. But the two Daniels females opened up fire on the posse, keeping them at bay while the men of the house could make good their escape. The Daniels version of the story seems much more realistic. According to that side of the family, Clearisa was tending the house post-holiday dinner while the children were scattered about various parts of the house, playing as usual. It has been told that the firing on the house started from across the river on the West Virginia side by the posse headed by Mose Christian. Realizing that gunfire was raining upon their home, the family said they huddled together for safety. They said Martha Daniels stood in the doorway, her mother Clearisa standing behind her. Directly behind them in the doorway was Charles Daniels Sr. Huddled around the floor were several small children. When the shots began to fly from the West Virginia side, the crowd huddled together behind the door. A steel bullet from one of the Winchesters came crashing through the casing of the door and pierced the forehead of little Martha Daniels, exiting the back of her head, crossing the room and becoming lodged inside a washboard at the rear of the hallway. Immediately following that bullet, another one tore through the walls and right into Clearisa Daniels' neck, right here, just above the right shoulder, and went down through her body to the left hip where it stopped. One of the next shots fired into the house entered from the rear and went through the fleshy part of the upper arm of Albert Daniels. Charles Sr. and one of his younger sons claimed to have seen Christian fire the shot, and the old man even told how he saw him pump his gun, raise it to his shoulder, and then fire. Charles Sr. cried out aloud with grief and is said to have called down the displeasure of the Lord on the murderers of his daughter and wife. When Jim Daniels, who was upstairs, heard the crying, he knew that someone had been hit. So he rushed down the stairs, saw his sister lying dead, his mother dying, and his brother injured. His father told him, "For God's sakes, give yourself up," and told him he would send a horse to get him away. Jim said something unintelligible to his father, and as he did so, he dashed out the front door in plain view of the entire West Virginia posse, who fired shot after shot from across the river while he disappeared from sight. The Kentucky posse, meanwhile, rushed to the house where Bud Christian was, pointed a gun at the old man, who had his badly injured wife in his arms and his dead daughter on the floor beside him. Charles Sr. told his nephew and his men that the problem that stood between them and his son were just that, between them, and had nothing to do with his wife and daughter. He stressed how they, as well as Hiram, had died senseless deaths, and pleaded with the two men to just drop it. But as he recalled it, they told him to shut up or they would shoot him too. Charles pleaded for his life and was finally spared when the posse on the West Virginia side kept shouting that Jim Daniels was getting away. What does remain untrue is that little Martha, okay, right here, said to be some sort of deranged teenage super soldier, when in fact she was only around 9 years old. She was a child. Today we're going to see exactly on her headstone how old it said she was. Did they just blindside the family and kill whoever they saw first in a murderous rampage, and then try to paint the picture to not look quite so terrible after murdering an innocent mother and her youngest child? Neither of which had ever murdered or even harmed anyone, to be clear. A newspaper article at the time said they buried little Martha while carrying Winchester rifles in case of an attack on the young girl's funeral. Clearisa, the mother, was still alive but mortally wounded. She lived just long enough to attend her little girl's funeral and then died later that night. Now, we bring you a lot of Hatfield-McCoy feud stories, and a lot of the other ones around here don't get the attention, you know. And things like this, like I've mentioned before, and Civil War battles and Hatfield-McCoy feud fights and various things, I've mentioned it before, that it's always the innocent bystanders, you know, wars even. It's always the children, you know, the innocent bystanders, the children who are always the ones that are caught up in those kinds of conflicts. And here we have a perfect example of that very scenario playing out. And right here are the graves of Clearisa and Martha. And there's Rosa. Amazing stories, isn't it? Just amazing stories all over the place. Well, if you think about it, right? Your story hasn't been told yet. It hasn't been finished. But there's all kinds of interesting details about your story already in there. And all of these graves are exactly the same. Every single one of these has some sort of story. Some stories may be shorter than others. Some stories may be just a few days long. But some are longer. Some weren't that much longer. But right here is actual proof. You know, according to the stories, you know, she was painted as this, like I said, this 16-year-old super soldier, you know, that supposedly, you know, shot the hat off of one of the guys, you know, blasting away with pistols. And it was a 9-year-old child. Right here's the marker. Nine years old. Have you ever seen? Can you imagine? No, of course not. Of course not. This is absolutely 100% not true. I don't buy that for one lousy second. And I'm guessing that most of y'all probably don't buy that story either. You know, but that's how feuds work. You know, it's a he said, she said. The victor is the one who writes the history. You know, not the losers. It's the victors, the ones who live, are the ones who write the history. And so that's how you wind up with stuff like this. But every now and then, somebody will do a little bit of digging. And like I said, we've worked on this one for a long time. And I believe, in my honest opinion, with seeing the grave, 1900 to 1909, I think this should put this, I think this should put this legend right here to rest, that little Martha May was some kind of super ninja or something, just blasting away at this posse, when, you know, in reality, they murdered a child, is what happened. They murdered a 9-year-old child and her mother. Hate does that, doesn't it? It has a way of doing that. You know, you try to keep yourself under control and all that kind of thing, but tempers flare. You know, humans can be some cruel people. They can be some cruel little individuals. And little Martha May right here is a really good example of what occurs in reality when that sort of thing happens. Anyway, y'all keep that in mind. Keep our little story in mind when you get to feuding with your neighbors, maybe. And keep little Martha in your prayers. And anyway, guys, we appreciate y'all for coming along today and listening to our little story, our little unknown feud. And I hope you enjoyed our little story and the beautiful scenery, the beautiful weather out here today, and the rooster and over there hollering. And anyway, guys, y'all have a really good day, and we will see y'all next time on the Hillbilly Files. Leo out.